Thank you for coming. My name is K.S. Bhaskar, and I work for a company called FIS. And I'm not sure whether it's better to be the last speaker before lunch or the, where you're standing between the audience and food, or the first speaker after lunch where the audience is recovering from lunch. But anyway, we'll see how it goes. So we're going to talk about the free and open source VistA EHR. So we're basically going to talk about what VistA is, and actually, maybe since you've been subject to so many speakers the last couple of days, instead of my talking about what VistA is, maybe I should ask you what VistA is. Then we'll talk a little bit about clinical transformation. David Wiles here is the CIO of Midland Memorial Hospital on the right. And then Ben Mehling of Medsphere will talk about the VistA technology stack, and I'll talk about the Vista FOSS landscape and then how you can get involved. So what is VistA? And basically the short answer is it's the Veterans Information System Technology Architecture or something like that. And we've had enough presentations about the origins of VistA within the Department of Veterans Affairs. And I think the important thing to understand is that it was born in adversity and under fire. Literally under fire. People had computer systems burned. Other people were fired. There's stories of one guy who the secretary at the receptionist called to say that the inspectors were coming, so he quickly shut down his computer, threw sacks over the computer, and led the inspectors through the computer room saying, oh, this is storage, it's a bunch of crates back there, and then, walked them through. So there's all kinds of stories about how it was born. And one of the interesting things is that the models of development, distributed development, incremental changes, short development cycles, all of those things which are now sort of the received wisdom of software development, independently evolved in VistA, and those have been part of the DNA and part of the culture. And within the Department of Veterans Affairs, VistA runs approximately 160 hospitals, several hundred clinics associated with those hospitals, and it's essentially a complete ERP system. So it does for the VA essentially all of the hospital stuff. So in addition to the electronic patient record, they've got applications in there for managing supplies and scheduling and HR and finance and all sorts of things like that. And it's been adopted outside the Department of Veterans Affairs in the Department of Defense and the Indian Health Service. And there's actually a sort of a sad story about the Department of Defense, because they wanted an electronic health record system for their bases. And they could have had the VistA system for free just for asking, but they chose to put out a contract because they said, oh, our needs are different. There are no pediatric veterans, but we need pediatrics. And they could have had the software and they could have added this stuff. Instead, they put out a contract, and then they had a bake-off between vendors, and one of the vendors basically took VistA, added in the additional stuff, and was able to demonstrate pretty much all the functionality that they needed for a fraction of the cost, and they got the contract and went on to make hundreds of millions of dollars, taxpayer expense, selling back to the government what the government had pretty much already developed. So VistA under the Department of Defense is not open source. It's a proprietary piece of software. But the Indian Health Service, which is part of the Department of Health and Human Services, and they provide applications to the various Indian nations, and they actually took VistA and they've developed it into an application called RPMS. So it's pretty much the same DNA, different name, and they've again added some of the capabilities that VistA is missing, the pediatrics and the women's health and the population health and so on, and that's also used, and it's just recently, RPMS itself has been released under the Freedom of Information Act. So VistA is available under the Freedom of Information Act. Software developed by the US government, unless it's one of several protected categories, is essentially available to anyone, and it's in the public domain. So you can get VistA from under FOIA. And one of our speakers this morning was Phil Longman. He's written this book called The Best Care Anywhere. It's very easy to read, so for anyone that's interested in VistA, I recommend it. Now, outside the federal government, it's used in the secondary care environment at a number of hospitals, and we have David Wiles of Midland Memorial here to talk about it. In the primary care environment, it's been adopted by a couple different types of organizations. There are a few single physician offices, and some of them have been sort of physicians with who are IT savvy, up to networks of primary care environments like Clinica Adelante, which is in the Phoenix, Arizona area, and other things that don't quite fit with primary or secondary care, such as the Oklahoma State Veterans Homes. And it's increasingly adopted internationally as well. And there's a couple of different adoptions here. Some of the early adoptions were Egypt, for example, the National Cancer Institute. And I would say that, in some sense, that's been a failure because they successfully implemented VistA, but the thing about the software business is that if you have it running today, that's an opportunity. It's like being in the newspaper or the magazine business. If you put out the software today, it's an opportunity to put out another edition tomorrow and something else a day after, and it's an evolutionary process. So it's a process, not an end-user state. And they didn't see that in Egypt, and similarly in Mexico. It's widely used in the Social Security Administration at about 60 of their secondary care hospitals. But again, they saw that as a snapshot, not as something as a process. And I think in the long run, that's not going to be very successful. Jordan is rolling out VistA throughout the entire country. They're in pilot phase right now. And again, they are going to maintain this evolutionary process. It's now live at the Rajiv Gandhi Cancer Institute in New Delhi, India, and other hospitals in India are deploying it. So there's a lot of use outside the US as well. And so that gives me a segue into David Wiles, who's going to talk about some of the clinical transformation with VistA.
Hello, I am David Wiles, the CIO at Midland Memorial Hospital in Midland, Texas, which is on Interstate 20, about halfway in between Fort Worth and El Paso. So we're pretty much out in the middle of nowhere. Real brief background. Again, I'm coming to this from the from the consumer side. I am not a developer, so we went through a process starting about 6+ years ago, and came across VistA real quickly. Midland, again. The city population is 101,000, and including the surrounding area is roughly 120,000+. So a small, typical city. We have one hospital, Midland Memorial, that has 2 sites, roughly 4 to 4.5 miles from each other. Our West Campus serves primarily women and children's, and the main campus is full-service acute care. 320 licensed beds, annual inpatient admissions about 11,000. So, again, probably fairly typical of a small small to mid-sized hospital. We began our journey into the VistA world in 2003 when we were kindly given sunset notices from our major vendor at the time of a couple of our primary systems that we used in the hospital. We had been talking for quite a number of years about electronic health records. About that same time, Bush had created the ONC. We had the Leapfrog group coming on board. There was discussion of pay per performance, a lot of external factors as well as internal desire to go to an electronic record. And the hospital as a whole just felt like it was the right timing considering our sunset notices. However, we were grossly missing funds for the project. Came across VistA, signed a professional services contract for the installation, implementation, training, a lot of custom programming for interfacing at the time to our other systems. Spent the next basically year and 1 month to implement and bring the system fully live to the point that in February of '07, we went around 4 o'clock in the morning and literally pulled all of the paper legacy charts out of the hospital. That morning the physicians came in, they had the VistA system to work with. Of course, we had a great deal of preparation prior to that, so it wasn't any kind of surprise to them. In January of '08, at HIMSS, we were recognized as a Stage 6 hospital. Would like to reach Stage 7, but we're not quite there yet for a number of other reasons. This gives you basically the HIMSS EMR adoption model. Again, our recognition of Stage 6. There are a few Stage 7 hospitals at this point. With one of the implementations we just went live with last week, I'm very hopeful that within the next, before the next HIMSS certainly, that we'll be able to make Stage 7. We've had several recognitions from different organizations for the accomplishments that we have made. Basically, I'm here somewhat as a poster boy for essentially demonstrating that putting the VistA system in a private sector hospital is, in fact, very much a doable and thing that we've shown can exist in reality. Our total budget to start with was just under $6.4 million. A large part of that, again, was our contract with Medsphere for implementation, training, again, a great deal probably, and it's even ongoing today as far as interface development and privatizing the software for the private sector. It really is about the healthcare. When I started down this road, I was not looking specifically for an open source solution. What we were looking for was an affordable solution that was the best solution we could find for an electronic health record. As it came to pass, we as an organization felt that the VistA system in and of itself was a world-class system. It literally, as one of the earlier speakers, I would certainly put it up against any of the major healthcare electronic health records today. It's not a panacea. We have interfaced a number of other systems to it to make it as seamless as possible as a single system. We do use the pharmacy package, we use the VistA lab package, we use the VistA radiology package to the extent that it's configured and fully operable to allow us to integrate or interface to a third-party radiology and PACS system. That integration, there's a lot of debate between do you use integration or interface. It's an interface, but it's very seamless for the end user experience. It essentially looks like one system between VistA and our third-party radiology and PACS system. Again, VistA, some of the things that went into my decision making and the decision making of the hospital is, it is a proven product. It's been around at the time we were looking at it 20 plus years. It's very mature, it's stable, it works. It just works. It does the job. Medication or medical care in the VA is the same as medical care in our hospital. Medical care is pretty much the same everywhere. Certainly, being adopted in 260, 270 plus, I think, or 170 plus at the time, VA facilities. They've closed a few since then. And again, the innovation that went into that product, you've heard a lot, or those of you that have been here through the earlier sessions have heard a lot of stories about, Fred described it yesterday as kind of the genetic, evolution and how that whole cycle, and it truly is that. That's one of the things that certainly attracted me. One of the key factors was the availability of a commercial organization, private sector, because we knew the VA was not in the business of supporting private sector hospitals. A support organization that was a formal corporate structure. We knew they were going to be around for a while. Again, the open source world today, even in the last 7 years, has come a long, long way. And back then, there was really no organization that existed. There were a number of loose-knit groups, but no real formal corporate organization. That's when we came across Medsphere. There are now a number of other players in the marketplace, which I'm very glad to see, and quite frankly, we anticipated and hoped for at the time. And again, affordability. Like so many hospitals in markets our size, back then and even today, we were struggling financially just to keep our doors open. Couldn't afford the $20 to $30+ million that most of the major vendors, the Cerners, the Epics, the McKessons were asking for implementing a comprehensive electronic health record. So that was certainly a key driving factor. In terms of implementation and the implementation cycle, even before we signed a contract with Medsphere, we went through a year and a half of due diligence of investigating VistA. What is it? Becoming educated. The whole hospital executive staff, the physician staff, to the extent that we could get them engaged, became engaged, all of the clinical staff. We had a lot of internal marketing programs that we did in terms of things like Name the System contest and monthly or bi-weekly newsletters that went out, keeping everybody up to date on the progress of the project. So there was a lot of before contract and after contract engagement with the entire hospital. Not just, it was never an IT project. It was never pitched as an IT project. It was an organizational project, and we had to have buy-in. At the end of the day, before we signed, about a week before we signed well, not a week, but about a month, because the board had to approve it after that. We had a round table executive staff. We had a steering committee that was going through this process for a year and a half, and it was a unanimous vote. We took a vote, literally, just around the table, yes or no, up and down, whether we wanted to move forward and sign a contract with Medsphere. And without exception, all of the key stakeholders, physicians, every single department manager, all the executive staff were engaged and voted to move forward with the project. Again, education, internal education was just a huge factor, I think, in the success that we've had, both from then up till now. In a lot of ways, it's a sales job to educate and sell the organization internally to the benefits, even though there was, at that time, again, a high deal of risk involved with a project like this, since it was so unique. We had actually gotten funding from VHA Health Foundation, which is an organization in Texas that we belong to, that partially funded the project. There was a lot of buy-in that was required in that respect. There, even today, from the perspective of most people I talk to around the country and other hospitals, healthcare providers, not developers, and the group basically that's represented here, there's a great deal of fear continuing for open source. So any opportunity that I can get to educate that sector to the possibilities of open source, the benefits of open source, I try to take that. I'm going to go through a couple of slides here. Again, the bottom line is it's really about the patient's safety. It's about the patient's well-being more than it's about the software, the computer system. As I said, this was an organizational project. It's not an IT project. And so, some of the major benefits that we've seen from implementing the system. And I'm going to go into, can I have that piece of paper there? Basically the open source benefits in a minute, but just from an organizational standpoint, one of the huge benefits of an electronic record is the global access to the record. Within a hospital, there are many stakeholders. There's the physician, there's the nurses taking care of the patient, there's social services, there's the dietitians, the quality assurance department, respiratory therapy. They may all need access to a patient's record at the same time. So, electronic access to a record has just been, it's been an entire change in the culture. There's no more playing, where's the chart? Somebody lost the chart, give me the chart. Of course, the physician always has first access, so everybody else has to wait. There's been, innumerable improvements in the clinical processes, all the way from order entry. From day one, when we brought up our first clinical departments, we've had physician order entry in place. Again, we installed the product in approximately 24 months, and in reality, we really installed it in less than 18 months, because the first 6 to 9 months were spent in the background in development, in interfacing it to other systems, and in putting in the private sector enhancements. For example, the concept of a patient account number is not present in VA FOIA VistA per se. So, that enhancement needed to be incorporated into the product so that we could integrate it to other systems, largely our registration system, which sits on the front end. We don't use VistA for registration. We use a third-party proprietary system. It feeds through our Mirth interface engine, and I love Mirth. That's another open source product that we use. Creates the patient chart in VistA, and then on the back end, VistA sends billing information at certain trigger points that we've defined for pharmacy, medication, and laboratory. So we use proprietary software on the front end for registration and on the back end for billing. Everything else in the healthcare process takes place within VistA. Medication administration has been a major direct benefit of clinical transformation, clinical improvement, in the sense that we use what's called barcode medication administration, which is the bedside medication administration that was described earlier. That has resulted in dramatic reductions in errors in medication administration. It doesn't prevent them 100%. There's still ways to make errors, but it does assure that you do have the right patient at the right time, the right medication, the right dosage, the right route. So it's been just a major part of improvement in our clinical outcomes. Documentation, both physicians and nursing, everybody uses the system for documentation. Results are available immediately, whether it's lab results, radiology reports, any kind of respiratory therapy treatments, all of that information instantly available. Like I said, it's a world or an organizational changing process. We've had many improved clinical outcomes. Some of them are very directly related to the electronic record, to VistA. As I mentioned, medication reduction of errors is 100% related to the use of VistA and the closed loop medication cycle that's available. Other areas, for example, reduced central line infection rates, we've had dramatic improvements there. You can see the chart on the right where the kind of improvements we've had before we implemented the VistA system and after we went fully live with the VistA system. We had a third-party Perot that did started out as a return on investment study. It turned into really a benefits and clinical transformation study. And they did a lot of data gathering of our statistics prior to the time we began implementing the system, compared those to when the system was totally live. So provided a lot of hard evidence in terms of the improvements of clinical outcomes. It's improved patient satisfaction tremendously from the standpoint of, I've walked down the hall and seen in our orthopedics unit where they'll roll a mobile cart up and be showing the patients their x-rays online, going through their chart with them and showing them how their vital signs have, changed over time, those kinds of things where the patient can actually see their own record. And that's really, it's really been an interesting experience from that standpoint. Our overall mortality rate has been reduced significantly. A couple of, again, real tangible benefits are one of the stories that I was told by one of our nurse managers is that prior to VistA, it was very typical that when a patient went from a unit on the floor to surgery and then back, the doctor after surgery orders their medication profile, and by the time before we implemented VistA, the patient would get back to the nursing unit, and maybe an hour or 2 hours later, the medications would show up on the floor. Typically now, the medications are waiting between the time the doctor writes the orders or puts the orders into the system after his surgery and the time the patient gets back up to his room, the medications are waiting for him. So more timely administration of medications makes a difference, again, downstream in the patient's outcome, and that's just been a tremendous benefit. That pretty much covers most of my presentation. There's a few other things I had made notes on. As I mentioned, we do use Mirth as open source. I mean, I love some of the pieces of Fred's presentation yesterday and the benefits that open source in terms of the innovation, the incorporation of different ideas into a system that's just physically, it's absolutely not possible with a proprietary system, a closed proprietary system. You just can't have that kind of feedback loop and development, and that's certainly a huge benefit for us. Again, I didn't go out for open source, but the benefits of open source have just been enormous. I do primarily interface work. I do most of the interface work, and it's just been a real lifesaver to be able to go in and be able to pull out the source code for an interface that already exists. We have another interface that's going to be so very, very close, and be able to take that, make some minor modifications, tweak the source code, put it back in, have another system online without having to call these guys. That's just tremendous. We do use Postgres SQL. We use Perl. I use a lot of tools around the VistA system that help enhance what we get out of it. Again, I mentioned the interface work, and the value from open source in terms of just the entire culture and the way that enhances software in general has just been an enormous side benefit for us. So I'm going to hand it over to Ben Mehling now. He is with Medsphere Corporation.
Thank you. Thanks, David. Okay, so I'm going to talk through what we would consider our open stack, and I'm going to try to move kind of quickly because we've heard a lot about VistA today from, I think, some other speakers, and I think probably, as Bhaskar mentioned, this group is well down the path of understanding it. One of the things that I'm always a little concerned about when people hear about VistA is they think of it as kind of this big application. And the fact is, we heard earlier today that it's not an application, it's a process. That's true from a business process reengineering standpoint on the clinical side. It's certainly true from a development perspective, the ways that you develop within the VistA system. There's a process that you go about doing that. But from an actual technology side, tangible, the system is really a set of interrelated applications. There's hundreds of them. within the system. It's built around core services and data that all of the applications use, and there's a loose framework for developing those. So you can there's a URL here for what the VA refers to as the VistA monograph. It lists all of the applications and it categorizes them, et cetera. Some of the other, I think, key points that I'd add on this front is historically, this has been a distributed development, or the system has been developed under a distributed model. So there is, as you start to delve into the applications, you'll see differences across them. You'll see different patterns. You'll also see, as a system that's been developed over decades, you'll see different patterns based on when the application was actually developed, based on what was going on in computing at that time. So there's you see some evolution within the system as you go. And in fact, I was mentioning this to someone that asked earlier. It has its own sort of portability stack. There's a kernel to it. There's tasking. Things that you'd normally get from an operating system actually exist inside of this framework and are relied upon heavily. From an actual application standpoint, besides the categories you see there, it's everything, as David mentioned, from your what we refer to as departmentals, laboratory, pharmacy, radiology, the things that power in the boiler, generally in the basement of a hospital, that power the hospital, all the way to disease registries. There's systems within it for clinical workflow, vitals collection. We talked about order entry, physician order entry, provider order entry, computerized provider order entry. These are things that in this particular industry or in the EMR, EHR world are very important from a safety perspective. BCMA for medication administration. And then you start getting out into sort of the wilds of VistA, where you can get everything from volunteer services, library management services, police and security. There's a lot of applications in there that the VA has used because they had nothing else at the time. You might interface to something differently today, but when they were going through and building it, you can see a lot of that still in there. So the monograph's a good place to look. I wanted to go through the stack somewhat quickly. It is a client-server application, very traditional-looking architecture. You've got your operating system. I don't have to mention any names. I think everyone here is familiar with the operating system that you'd see in the open-source stack. There is an M engine. We've talked about MUMPs today. There is kind of one dominant open-source M engine out there. There's some proprietary ones as well. I won't mention any names. Between the M engine and the applications, you have kind of that core operating system piece that I mentioned. There's even a mail tool in there. So intercommunication between the departments, there's a mail tool that people use. And it's used for interoperability even between different VistA systems. So all of those services are provided up into the application stack. You can see the departmentals and the other things on the left there. In sort of the green, and then on the right, you see the modules, the underlying modules that support the application sitting on the top. So these names aren't necessarily meaningful, but CPRS is going to be the view that the providers see, the chart, where you're going to look at laboratory, where you're going to look at your orders, your diagnoses, your medication lists, clinical documentation. All of those things are contained within that tool. And then you have some other tools there that are sort of ancillary. Everything from the barcode administration to writing group notes if you're in a behavioral health arena. So all these are sorts of the tools that the VA has developed in their distributed model and over years have been added onto the stack. So the last thing was, and again we have heard lots about MUMPs and a little bit about FileMan over the last couple days. So very quickly some stats on it. I think if there were some key takeaways besides the history of it, which everyone heard earlier today, there's a lot of FUD out there about MUMPs in VistA. You hear when people talk about VistA, they talk, well, it's built on this MUMPs thing. The reality is, and this is the secret that I think most people don't talk about, is most of the other healthcare applications rely on MUMPs as well. The big ones, Epic, a lot of the GE stuff, Quest Labs, Partners Health. There is tons of MUMPs in healthcare, so to speak. So I think people shouldn't be scared away by a very reliable system that's been around for a lot of years, well vetted. And the other thing I'd mention is lots of other industries as well. You see it in finance all over the place. Besides Bhaskar's company FIS, which provides a large banking application, Bank of England, Barclays, they all use MUMPS. Ameritrade, they all use MUMPS in the underlying system. So a very maligned programming language and system, unfortunately. The other piece here that's specific to VistA is the database management system. File Manager is what it's referred to as. It relies on a lot of the underlying performance that you get from the MUMPS data structures. But again, it's used widely. Besides the VA, the Indian Health Services, and the DoD, it's used in other applications. Bhaskar was relaying a story about an aircraft maintenance application that was written using FileMan as well. So I wanted to touch quickly, and I know I'm running out of time. I wanted to touch quickly on sort of the future from our perspective. One of the things that we are not necessarily concerned about, but aware of, is in order to build a community around something like VistA, you've got to gain contributors, and it's hard to tell someone that's entering this community, well, just go learn MUMPS. Go learn a programming language is probably not the optimal way to bring contributors into your community. So there's a number of tools out there that have been built and projects that are ongoing now to extend VistA as a platform. So you've got something like OVID that can be used in a lot of different ways. There's some URLs here at the bottom, and this presentation is shared, so folks can delve into that later. Basically a way to extend on top of a VistA platform using something like Java or other programming languages through web services, SOAP and REST. You've got something like FMQL, which is a semantic web endpoint that was built on top of FileMan. So you can do semantic interop between VistA systems and other systems. The gentleman that worked on this project showed at a recent conference interoping between a VistA system and a set of databases that included an array of terminologies, and being able to walk those using semantic queries, Sparkle query language. So another way to get at the data. There's a platform called EWD that provides a way to extend existing MUMPS applications into the web world. They have a AJAX framework that can be used. And FM Projection, which is a FileMan projection utility that basically we wrote a MySQL storage engine that understands FileMan, connects to a VistA server, and projects the FileMan structures into a relational format, if you will, for querying and extraction, et cetera. So just another way to get at the data. So I don't have the time to go through these in depth, but again, I've provided the references on the bottom. So if you're interested in any of these projects or how you could use these, you're welcome to view the slideshow. And I think with that, I'm going to hand it back over to Bhaskar. Thank you.
Thank you. How are we doing for time?
10 minutes.
10 minutes, okay. Thank you. So let me just sort of talk about the FOSS landscape of VistA, and sort of here's where there are opportunities to get involved. So there are several VistA events that happen throughout the year. Twice a year, World VistA organizes VistA community meetings. These are hosted by organizations such as universities, the National Library of Medicine, and they're held in locations around the country twice a year, January and June, and they basically bring the entire VistA community together, all providers, programmers, vendors, and it's an opportunity to interact. There 4 days. And then World VistA also, in the spring and the fall, has VistA education seminars, and these are typically, they've been hosted by Robert Morris University in Pittsburgh, and these are places where the VistA community meetings are sort of more presentation, interaction. Here it's more sort of tutorial and more in-depth course material. And the VA itself has their own internal training. It's called the VHU, and it stands for something like VistA Electronic Health University. And these are traditionally open only to people inside the VA. But as of this year, they're actually opening up a few slots to people outside to sign up and pay some money and attend. There are several distributions of VistA, and again, you can think of these as, just as in the Linux space, there's Red Hat and Debian and Novell and so on, and they're different distributions, but they all share common DNA. And Red Hat may take some code, make some changes. You get Red Hat Enterprise Linux 5.1, 5.2, etc., and they make their changes available back to the the mainline Linux kernel code, and all the different Vista distributions share a lot of that DNA. So FOIA Vista, which is Vista available under the Freedom of Information Act from the VA, is sort of the origin of many of these. There's now a FOIA RPMS, which came out recently. There's VistA EHR, which took FOIA Vista and then adapted it for use in primary care, and actually took it through CCHIT certification in 2007. There's Medsphere Open Vista, and more recently there's DSS's VX Vista. There's a number of, like any open source community, there's a lot of different projects which are going on. There are a whole bunch of interfaces going on for practice management and an external laboratory. The VA operates their own internal laboratories, but in the real world, you need to interface to Quest and LabCorp and so on, and these interfaces is work done on the outside. There's e-prescribing and what's called prescription finishing. There's projects underway. One of the interesting projects is the continuity of care record, continuity of care document, and these are actually standards, so you can actually give a patient an XML export of their records, and this is an active project that's underway. There are enhancements to the CPRS is the physician's primary interface. It's a thick client interface. People have enhanced it to do things like registration. So in a primary care environment, it's not restricted to doing the clinical interface, but you can also register the patient through that interface. Pediatric growth charts, and then there's technical enhancements as well. One of the things about Vista is, as I said, it's the classic model of lots of tiny increments rather than these giant steps where you go from version 1 to version 2. And and sometimes people don't want to see 25 different tiny increments happening. They'd like to bundle all of those into something that they apply every week or every 2 weeks. So there's projects underway to bundle those, and then there are projects underway to port RPMS to an open source stack and to merge RPMS and Vista. RPMS sort of, as the Indian Health Service puts it, they follow a safe distance behind the VA and in adopting the VA's code. And then there's Astronaut, which is another interesting package. It's sort of like a meta packaging effort to take Vista and a whole bunch of other things, and then you can literally install Vista on your computer system in a matter of minutes. But this actually takes that and also installs the thick client and so on. So there's a lot of these projects. There's a whole bunch of organizations. There's a couple of nonprofits. There's World Vista, which is a 501c3. There's the Vista Expertise Network, which is based in Seattle, and their focus is training of Vista and MUMPs. And they actually take a training model where you go and sort of spend a couple of days interacting with the instructors in class session, and you go to your home, and then it's sort of like an apprenticeship, an electronic apprenticeship program. Do you have a question? And then there are commercial organizations that'll install Vista, that'll support it. There's MUMPS vendors, one MUMPS vendor in there, and then there's a whole bunch of consultants. So there's a fairly large ecosystem there. And in terms of where you can go, there's several different lists. Hard hats is where all of the techies hang out. And if you go out there, it's high volume, there's a lot of traffic, not all of it may be of interest. But if you want to sort of really be tightly wired into the community, join that list. For business-related stuff, like if you're looking for someone to partner on and so on, there's a group called the World Vista Services. And then one of the things we try to do, because we'd like to encourage in groups like the hard hats, we'd like government employees, like the VA employees, to participate. We don't want the hard hats to go into things like advocacy and pending legislation and so on, because that affects their ability to participate. So there's another list called the Vista list, and here you can go out and you can, express opinions on pending legislation and try and rally people to come and, wave the flag and so on. Several different communities. There's the Hard Hats community, so there's a website in the community in addition to the list. There's a worldvista.org, and then Medsphere and DSS have their own community sites. And this is sort of like a list of all of the places that you can go and things you can do to get involved in VistA. So at this point in the last couple of minutes, I'd like to turn it over for questions and comments. Yes, sir.
You described World VistA Medsphere as like Debian and Red Hat and whatever. Is there a upstream where the changes go back, or are all they just forks and are now all diverging away?
Well, no. It's a good question, because I think the VA has gone through. The pendulum keeps swinging. At times, they're extremely willing to accept the changes from the outside. At other times, they sort of go through these phases when they don't want to accept changes. And they've recently been in a phase where they weren't accepting changes. I think the pendulum is now swinging to where, once again, they'll accept the changes.
The ones that are, is there some code base that, some branch from which you all sprang,
well, that is,
you all go back to, even if VA doesn't take it?
well, that is in some sense, because of the distributed nature of VistA development, even if the VA does not take the patches that have been developed in the community, they'll go back to, like, World VistA is like the next level down from the VA in terms of, taking sources and as a nonprofit. And I think that, all of these changes are largely non-conflicting, and they can be reasonably freely, reintegrated back together at some point when the VA does come back to taking the changes. There was actually a question back there. Yes, Brian?
I think it's kind of a similar question, but in the early days of the Linux community, even though you did have Linux as kind of the air traffic controller of this kernel, it was important to have the Linux standards-based project to start to say, here's the larger set of things that can be considered a platform, right? So that people building apps or wanting to fix bugs or just come up to speed know that they're not being channeled in one distribution versus another, or something they don't realize when they first make their investment, right? Is there anything emerging along those lines in this?
Yes, there's actually actually that's a fairly complicated answer, but the simple thing is, yes, right from the beginning there have been these things called namespaces for routines, for variables, and then there's parts of the code that are identified as core and parts which are identified as applications. Now, the thing is, could that be better documented? Yes. Could we encourage people? Are there people who follow it better than others? The answer to that is yes, because you can't force people, even with the Linux standards base, you can't force people to follow the standard. But anyway, such things do exist. Actually, there's a question back there, and then that's the last question? Okay, thank you.
As far as certified system for meaningful use, are y'all doing it on a hospital basis, or is there each distribution doing it, or is one individual group doing it? Going for certification.
So the question is, on meaningful use, where's the certification happening? It's generally going to be happening at the distribution level.
The distribution level?
Yep.
Is Middleton going to have to go after it themselves, or do they go through?
They're going to go with their vendor. Whatever distribution you're following is likely who you're going to.
Once that happens, with all the changes, how are y'all going to keep that in sync when people give back to that? How are you going to keep that in sync? I got a certified product that's getting changed by people that aren't being certified, because I wouldn't think the VA was planning on getting certified.
The VA, I don't believe is going to look to get certification.
Right. So at that point, does everything start forking at that point?
I would say that the distribution, there can be sharing between the distributions, but the general questions that I'm hearing are around: is there a current formal project to make sure that those are, and that doesn't exist right now.
No, I mean after it gets certified. And then you start adding to it.
I guess in my mind, certification is just like any other enhancement. It would just be a part of that same process if that existed. Right now, it has to happen at the distribution level, unfortunately. The VA most recently has become more interested in potentially participating for real in the open source community. At that point, hopefully you'd have an upstream provider. Right now, that doesn't exist. It's like, you've got your biggest contributor in the room not participating. That's how the VistA community works.
Well, is that it?
We're out of time.
We're out of time. Okay. Sorry here. So thank you very much. And we're going to be around for the rest of the conference if you'd like to find us and ask questions. Thank you.